make her bigger?
No. So,
He's giving my Outlook app.
everyone, I'd like to welcome everyone to our gathering on Hope this evening. I am delighted to introduce Sister Patricia Bruno, a Dominican sister from San Rafael. Patty, as you know, has been on the preaching team with her partner, Drew Siciliano, for many, many years. And they both have given retreats here in Amityville. I am very proud to call Patty a friend. I've been after her for a while to do something for us. So I'm delighted that she finally did agree to do this. So it's all yours now, Patty, okay?
Thank you. Yes, and I'm proud to have Margaret a friend of mine. So, and the other thing is that we both have the same birthday.
Oh, that's
Not,
right.
not the same year, but the same birthday. So anyway, I don't know if you want to put yourselves on mute. That way, if if the dog barks or something like that, then it's easier, or if you move around, it doesn't make as much noise. So, but at some time, I thought what I would do is kind of talk for a while and then say, give you a few minutes to think and then maybe respond. And I thought first we could look at the papers that you received. And the reason I'm doing this is I took parts of the talk and kind of wrote little blurbs about it, or I put the poems that I used. That's on the first side if you have your papers. I did it so you wouldn't have to take a lot of notes and you could remember without having to write a lot of things down. On the back side of the paper, or the second page of the paper, there's I wrote some of the authors that I allude to and the books that I have mentioned. So again, you don't have to be worried about taking a lot of, saying, I'd like to remember the name of that book or something. It's there. There's a couple I didn't put down. And then the one that says that the poem that says waiting in line, I love it because it was done by Nick, who's a fifth grader. And I thought the reason his teacher, who I have taught, now she's a teacher, but anyway, she had asked the children to think about meditation. And this is what he wrote as his response. I'm not going to use it tonight, but I just thought you might like to read it because it's just so charming, I think. And then if we have time, we can do the very last part, which is kind of a closing prayer. And if we don't have time, you can read it on your own or pray it on your own. So that's kind of the format that I'm going to follow. Just many of you probably signed up to spend some time reflecting on hope because it's important to us. And I will mention his book. I do a lot of reading of poetry. I love poetry. And there was I don't know if you ever listened to PBS, but Terry Gross did an interview recently with Christian Wyman. And I'll tell you a little bit about him later, but he has a book that he has written that's called 50 Entries Against Despair. And so after listening to the interview, I got the book. because I'm very, hope is so essential in our lives. And I decided that I wouldn't just start out with a definition of hope. It seems to me that a better way of learning something is to kind of take time to walk around it and look at it from different points of view. Maybe poetry or storytelling or proverbs. Um, I think it stirs our imaginations and it helps to give us insights into kind of dead end ways of thinking. So I've chosen some poems and some proverbs to allude to during this time. I also think that storytelling opens our minds and it doesn't force us to think in a particular way. I think that's why the parables are so great because they're stories, they're ancient stories, wisdom stories, and they kind of open up our minds and stir our imaginations. And hopefully, the good stories help us try to live into those kind of imaginations and hopeful images. Um, I was thinking too, when I was doing this, putting it together, I thought, well, why would you use storytelling and all? And I thought, yeah, in order to understand anything, it's important to uh, go at it from different points of view. And what came to mind was the story of Helen Keller, as you know, who was deaf and blind and mute. And I'm sure you've seen, I think it's called Water. I think that's the name of the movie. But the one where her teacher, Annie Sullivan, tries to communicate with her. She's deaf, she's blind, and she doesn't speak. So Annie immerses her. Remember that scene with the water where Helen has water in her hand, and Annie splashes it on her face and she tastes it. Every single part of her is being wet with it or tasting it. And then Annie spells on her hand using sign language the word water, and it breaks through what it means. It's the beginning of communication. So I thought, yeah, we could use storytelling. I won't splash it in your face, but we could use storytelling. We can use poetry. We can use proverbs. We could use scripture and try to look at it in different ways. So I think the most obvious and first poem that came to mind is the one by Emily Dickinson, which most people know. And it's the one that she says, hope is um, hope is a thing with feathers. And in other words, I remember when I first read that a long time ago, I thought that's a funny way with feathers. But it's kind of the image that she uses is that no matter how big or small the storms are, there's always the bird, the hope that is singing within us. So that was her way of saying it. But more recently, I read, and this might echo and maybe a little bit of what I said at the retreat, I'm not sure. But Charles Piguet is a poet, and he lived in 1911, right at the time when the shadows of World War One were starting to come over Europe. And personally, in his life, he was going through a very difficult time. And he wrote a poem called The Portal to the Mystery of Hope. And he gives us a way of looking into uh, hope from his point of view. And they often say that when you are struggling with something such as hope, as he was, because he felt his life was falling apart. It was the beginning of World War One. Things in Europe were pretty dark. They say that people often write about hope when they're struggling with despair. And that's what he did. So on your papers, I wrote this out so you can see. And all three of them are feminine figures. So Faith, he says, is a loyal wife. Charity is like a mother. And Hope is a small child. And in the poem, he calls her a little girl, nothing at all. And Hope seems rather insignificant, but very trusting. And in the poem, she kind of skips through in between her two older sisters. And no one takes much notice of her. But this little girl, Hope, every night goes to bed. She sleeps very well. She gets up in the morning. She's refreshed and renewed. She might seem kind of simplistic, but throughout the poem, she's contrasted with her two older sisters, Faith and Charity. And at the end of the poem, it is God who says that hope is the great surprise, a surprise that even surprises God. In the poem, it says, Faith is like a wife who sees only what is, while hope can imagine what could be. Charity is like a mother who loves only what is, but hope can imagine what will be and loves what will be. And even though she's small, she is the great surprise because she keeps putting one foot in front of the other and in that motion, making decisions, one foot in front of the other, her life is transformed. I think it's a lovely image of hope that that someone who always, it certainly is not inactive and seems small, but when we make one decision after another, that something better comes from that. Um, I wonder when I was reading this and the end part said that even God is surprised by hope. And in the poem, it says that hope is the greatest marvel of grace. And when I was reflecting on it, I thought, I wonder why. I wonder if that's why in Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 18, verse 3, where Jesus says, unless you become like a little child, you cannot enter into the reign of God. That sometimes we think about the reign of God as being in heaven or some far place off, but actually the reign of God, the presence of God is present tense. And so in Matthew, he says, unless you become like a little child, you cannot enter in the reign of God, into the presence of God, or maybe it's into the awareness of the presence of God. I was also thinking of this because since all of you have Dominican connections, you might remember over a year ago at Christmas time, the letter that came from our sisters in Ukraine. And of course, whenever you read their letters, and years before this, our Dominican sisters from Iraq, their letters never ended without a sense of hope. It was incredible that they would have hope in such hard situations. But last year, not this Christmas, but last year, in the sisters' letter from Ukraine, they quoted a Ukrainian poet. And he said this, in his poem, he says, love is very womanly. Faith is very manly. Only hope is still like a child. So think for a moment. Why is hope like a child? Is it because children have a sense of trust or imagination? Is it built into their DNA? Just think for a minute. What do you think? In just a couple of words. If anything comes to you, you'll have to unmute yourself.
I think it's a sense of wonder
Mm-hmm.
that keeps alive hope. Hope alive.
And I think it's the child's imagination. You know, a child can see things that aren't that aren't there. You know.
I think it's the imagination, but children have such a simple and beautiful sense of joy. They're refreshing. No hidden agendas. They're just wonderful.
You might want to write down some of these adjectives and descriptions, because at some time after this, you might want to write a poem or a prayer. And it's great having such a variety of vocabulary words to capture it. I asked one of the women who works with us, her name is Rena, and I said to her, Rena, she has a daughter who's, I think she's probably about in the third grade, and she's very precocious. She loves angels. I know that. And anyway, so I said to Rena, where do you get your hope? And she said, oh, my daughter.
No.
And I said, well, why? I mean, what made you say that? Could you give me, I knew I was giving this talk. So I said, could you give me an example? And she said, oh yeah, she said, my daughter loves angels. And she said I like you, maybe not so much in Long Island, but certainly here in our area, we have a lot of homeless people. I mean, homeless women, men, children. We're always working on housing. We have a commitment to St. Vincent de Paul, as many of you do. So anyway, Rena said, well, my daughter loves angels. She said one morning she came out to the kitchen and she said, Mommy, I have an idea. She said, last night I was visited with 5 angels in my dream. And she said, and they brought in this huge bowl of spaghetti. And they said to me, feed the poor. So, yeah. So, Rena says, she thought to herself, no, we are not going downtown with a bowl of spaghetti. So she said, she talked to her. She said, that is a wonderful idea. And then how impractical. She said, however, we could make sandwiches every week. We could get a loaf of bread and you and I can make sandwiches and we can bring them down to sing. So they've done that for the last couple of years.
Wow.
And then there was another boy who is a very good friend of Rena's daughter. This boy's in the 4th grade. And of course, they're very aware of the war. And so one day recently, he went to his mother and he said, Mom, he said, I'd like you to go to the principal with me. Because we used to have a peace pole in our schoolyard, and now we don't have it anymore. It was taken down because he has older brothers and sisters. So he knew it had been taken down. He said, I think we should put it back up again. So his mother said, fine, I'll go with you. So they went to the principal's office, and the principal very wisely said, let me think about it. So that always our answer. Let me think about it. And she said, I'll get back to you. And she did. She said, I talked to the teachers about it. And they all decided that would be a very good idea. So they had a ceremony and they put their peace pole back. And I think that echoes your idea about imagination and courage and seeing things in a with very clear vision as to this should be done. Why is it not being done? And also, like that little girl in the poem, doing something about it. So it's acting on our intuition. The book that I just mentioned by Christian Wyman, this is the book. Is that, oh, it's reversed, huh?
See,
All
no,
right.
No, it's good.
okay.
Yeah, and it's called Zero at the Bone. And he goes through his story about going through terrible chemotherapy, being extreme, going to Seattle for a bone marrow transplant. And he has two daughters, they're twins. And again, they're rather precocious, but he tells this story in his book about how aware the children were of his illness. I mean, obviously, it formed their whole pattern to their day. And he said every night he would say to Fiona and to Elijah, two daughters, he would say, I love you, Fiona. And she would say back, I love you too, Daddy, or to Elijah. But this one night he went in and he said to Fiona, I love you, Fiona. And he waited. There was no response. So he said, I love you, Fiona. Do you love Daddy? I'm sure you love Daddy. And all Fiona did was kind of look up, kind of like dreamy, and look up to the ceiling. And then she finally said, I will love you, and I will love you in the summertime. And it stopped him. I will love you in the summertime. For him, it was a prophetic statement that he would still be alive in the summertime. For her, who knows? You know, is it a way a child says, I'll love you forever? Words like that are really important to ponder, not just somebody else's experiences, but when we hear something that someone says to us that tweaks our imaginations and offers us a new way of thinking. It's important to pay attention. So hope and prayer have a subversive strength that they give us as we ponder our lives. They quietly, hope and prayer quietly undermine our fears and slowly, patiently help us work through some of our own struggles. If you want to read kind of a theological book about it, there's a book by N.T. Wright. He's an Anglican bishop, and he wrote a book that's called Surprised by Hope. I've read it a couple of times. Some people just love it. It's very good. So if you want to read something that's a little more theological. So now let's just shift a little bit to scripture. Certainly in scripture, hope is a big virtue. In Paul's letter in particular, he says, we are saved by hope. In Romans chapter 8, verse 24, as well as in Hebrews, he says, he calls hope an anchor, a gift that keeps us steady, especially when the seas are rough. Hope reminds us of what God has done for us from the very beginning of our lives. So, in other words, memory is an important aspect of hope. It reminds us of what God has done for us. And it's probably what keeps us going. We think back, well, yeah, I got through that terrible time, so I'm sure I'll get through this one. And in the early church, with original sin, it had nothing to do with Adam and Eve. But original sin in the early church, the definition was not remembering what God had done for us. I like that definition. I think it's a lot better than eating a piece of fruit off a tree somewhere. But our original sin is not remembering what God has done for us. So it's a continual remembering back. Sometimes it feels like hope is a little elusive because we seem to have it and then it disappears. But as I said, hope is really central to Scripture. One of the major stories about hope and how it doesn't always turn out the way we think it's going to turn out. We say we pray for this and something else happens. And yet it's a good thing that happens, but it's a surprise, might not look like what we hope for. It's that story of the manna in the desert. Remember that in the Old Testament, the major story going through the desert, and the Israelites are hungry. So they say to Moses, pray to God that we'll have food, that we'll have bread. And so Moses goes and prays, and the next morning, the Israelites come out of their tents and they look around. Well, there's no bread there, but there's that white sticky substance. So Moses says to them, eat it. It will keep you, it will fill you for the day. It will nourish you. And they pick it up and they say, it doesn't look like what we prayed for. And then they taste it. Doesn't taste like the bread we asked for, but they ate it and it gave them strength for that day. The next day, too, they went out and there it was. And they kept picking it, but it just wasn't what they had asked for. And yet, it fed them. And sometimes we think the word manna means bread, but really it means, what is it? And isn't that true with our prayers too? We pray for something and we get an answer, and it is something that has sustained us, but it doesn't always look like what we asked for or what we prayed for. We're kind of like the Israelites saying, manna, what is it? What is it? It's not what I hoped for. So to be hopeful people, we have to be open to surprises. Things might not turn out exactly the way we had hoped, but somehow within it, God is nourishing us. We think too about the road to Emmaus. And it's one of my favorite stories in Scripture because the disciples are walking on the road and they meet a stranger, and you can hear in their conversation that they feel betrayed. We had hope, they said. We had hoped to be set free. We had hoped that this person was going to be the Messiah. And it's not until later when they invite Jesus to stay with them, with the breaking of the bread, that their eyes are open. And hope is like that. It's here. We get we need eyes to see it, but often it comes in a different form. So thinking of surprises and hope that perhaps we have prayed for or hoped for, are there instances in your own lives where maybe you've hoped for something and it came out differently, but perhaps even better than what you had hoped for? or in a different way.
I would say many, many, many times.
And do those memories give you a sense of being able to hope more in the future or in your present life?
Me? You talking to me?
Yep.
Yes, of course. You know, I was thinking of a couple of things actually. I was thinking of the universe story and remembering. It's not only remembering, the span of our own lives, but 13.8 billion years worth of remembering and how much hope that gives us. I was also thinking of the Jesuit Tom Clark, who I had the privilege of knowing in New York City. And he once described imagination, which is it's connected, I think, to what you're talking about, as rearranging the elements of experience in order to make room for new possibilities. So it's kind of, God's imagination gives us hope,
Mhm.
you know.
And to go back to the whole universe, I mean, to think back as to how we were raised about what the world was like, and now to have just the explosive images of outer space and everything we're learning. It's like, for me, it's like I love that little girl because it's like she's open to new experiences and she doesn't have the answers to everything. And for me, it's hope, one of the elements is being able to be surprised. If we think we're in control and we want only one way, then it's hard to
Mhm.
be able to refocus something. So it's really to have the ability to let go of control of how things should be, to allow them to surprise us.
It's like the little girl who hopes for something for Christmas, but gets something totally different. What I hope for is not what God has planned. And
Mhm.
sometimes I hope that I get better, that I could walk, that my kidneys are okay. Sure, my kidneys getting better, but I can't see out of my right eye. That's a different story. But it's like, to me, it's like the child who hopes for something special for Christmas. How we all hope for something, and we were lucky if we got an orange. But at the time, we knew it was the best. It was something to eat. That's how I figure hope on.
Mm.
Mhm.
And then we just have to accept what God gives us as His answer to my hope.
Yeah, everything is not going to turn out. I mean,
No, of course not.
we
It's not
are
always
going to
gonna
get
turn out
sick.
right.
Right, we are going to
we-
get. So I guess the trick might be within that is still to be joyful. There are certain things that happen that
Right.
it doesn't mean being frivolous, but I think a person of hope has a sense of joy within them. There's a poem that's on your paper that might be, it's by Mary Oliver. And it says, oh, I didn't get to our little grain of hope. But anyway, it says, if you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give in to it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very kind. So much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back, that sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it in an instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb.
That's a great poem.
Oh.
Yeah.
Nice. Yes.
So, things are not always going to turn out the way we would like. But the poem, joy is not made to be a crumb. The other thing about hope too is the surprise. I remember one of the big surprises with hope for myself was when my mother was alive. She was deaf. And so those were the old-fashioned phones that you had, cell phones. And my brother, Peter, used to call her every day. Well, Peter went to World War II. When he came home, he said, I'm never going to church again. So my mother used to pray for him and whatever. But when he was 50 years old, and his wife, the secret in our family is she was 52, so she robbed the cradle. But she was 52. She had an aneurysm between her left eye and her brain, and she couldn't speak, and she was paralyzed. And from that time on, my brother took care of his wife. He loved cars, was a bit macho before this, but he used to get her up every morning. He would bathe her, put her makeup on. She could only say yes or no. He would get her in the wheelchair. And when he died, because he's deceased now, but when he died, my other brother said he's the saint in the family. But he was the one who never went to church. But one day he was talking to my mother, and at the very end, she said, well, Peter, I better go now. And he said, and I could hear it because I was right next to it. He said, pray for me, Mom, because it's only your prayers that get me through this. So we never know what the effect of our prayers are. And he would always say to me, he said, Mom never complains about anything. And my brother Peter never complained. He was the saint in our family. So, we're surprised by hope often. And our prayers certainly help us get there. I think the other thing with hope is to join other people. Hope doesn't travel by itself. It has other companions that hope walks with. And I was thinking, what are some of the large scale experiences we've all had about hope? And as I thought about them, I thought nationally, I thought one of them was, I wonder if Anita Hill ever thought she would live long enough to be part of the Me Too movement and hear the rallying cries and the experience of the mobilization of the next generation of courageous women. I've often thought about writing her a letter. I think I should. But I remember in the very beginning when she spoke out and how lonely she must have been.
Mhm.
And if I think locally, so you might want to do this later tonight, think nationally for you, locally for you. If I think locally, in 2009, on New Year's Day, Oscar Grant was murdered at a BART station, which is a public transportation station. And I wondered, his life and death mobilized us out here towards the Black Lives Matter movement. And if we think internationally about what might have surprised us, at least for myself, what surprised me is that a comedian could be the president of the Ukraine and be such a powerful person and in the midst of such darkness. And if I think of our church, I think of the Synod. Who would have ever thought the Synod could ever take place? Now, the real miracle will be if it takes place in the United States. But the Synod, I mean, to think about the Synod, who would have ever thought? I mean, that's the greatest thing in the church that has happened since Vatican II. So you might, for yourself, might just want to think about nationally, what is something that has happened? Internationally, it could be the Berlin Wall, even. Who would have ever thought? Locally, for yourselves, what has happened? And then church-wise, what has been a real symbol of hope for you? I don't know if any of you would just want to respond to any of those now or just take them as a note and think about them later. But if you have something that you want to respond to. So then I ask you, suppose these people that I mentioned had not acted on their vision. Suppose Anita Hill had not acted on her vision. Suppose, any one of the people you might think of didn't do something about it, and yet people rallied around. It takes a great deal of courage to be able to be a hopeful person. It's usually stepping out of line a little bit, being a little bold. We just went through just recently, I did with a friend of mine who we did an intervention with. And if you've ever been part of an intervention, this was with drugs. It's a tough thing. But at some point you have to act. And so far, it seems like it's going to be very hopeful. We'll see how it all turns out. But you have to act. Hope is a verb. We don't hear a lot about hope in the Gospels. And in fact, in the fourth Gospel, we attribute it, or the tradition is it's the Gospel of John, but it's not. It wasn't written by John. But in the fourth Gospel, hope is really a verb. And in fact, the translation of the word that they use, we in English don't really have an English translation for it. It really would be hoping. It's really a verb in the Gospels. And the reason we don't hear a lot about hope, the word hope, we hear it in the letters of Paul, we hear it in church documents, but we don't hear a lot about it in the Gospels because hope is Jesus. Hope was present with them. Hope was healing. Hope was feeding the poor. Hope was walking with them. And if you notice, all those words are verbs: feeding, welcoming, walking with, being present. So hope is really a verb in our life, and it takes courage to step out and do that. So why don't we look at Denise Levertov's poem for a minute. That's on yours, which is one of my very, very, very favorites. Denise Levertov was born in England, and she was she came to the United States in 1948, and she died in 1995. Her poetry, when I got a huge anthology of her poetry. I love her so much, but it's very clear. And she has a voice that's committed to beauty and the protection of the earth, the mystery of life, and a care for those who suffer. I met her, oh my, it must have been probably in the 80s when I was down in outside of Las Vegas in the desert where Los Alamos Lab is, and it's one of the most significant nuclear weapons testing sites in the United States. And we all spent some days together, and at night sometimes she'd read her poetry. But this is her poem, which I love. It's I thought it's appropriate because it's a New Year's poem, but it was written in 1981. He says, I have a small grain of hope, one small crystal that gleams clear colors out of transparency. I need more. I break off a fragment to send you. Please take this grain of hope so that mine won't shrink. Please share your fragment so that yours will grow. Only so, by division, will hope increase, like a clump of irises, which will cease to flower unless you distribute the clustered roots' unlikely source, clumsy and earth-covered of grace. So what do you think? What is the grain? What kind of a grain is she thinking of? Does anything come in mind? I'll read it again. I have a small grain of hope, one small crystal that gleams clear colors out of transparency. I need more. I break off a fragment to send you. Please take this grain of hope so that mine won't shrink. Please share your fragment so that yours will grow. Only so, by division, will hope increase, like a clump of irises, which will cease to flower unless you distribute the clustered roots, unlikely source, clumsy and earth-covered of grace. So do you have an image of the grain of hope? If you were to draw it, what might you draw?
It's like that fluffiness of a one of those weeds, daffodil. When it's a seed, it just floats. This is what I get as you were reading the poem, how it just floats in the air. But then where it lands, it comes to a beautiful flower, even though it's a weed. You know, that's what I got out of it when you were reading it.
Mhm.
I guess I was thinking of the awareness of beauty. It's like that grain. The more aware I am of beauty, it grows. And I don't know, but that's just what came to me.
I think it says for me, hope has to be divided, has to be shared. Otherwise, it won't continue to be hope. But just like she says about the daffodils, we divide them, they flourish, they procreate. Hope needs to be shared, needs to be, however, divided, whether that's shared in community, shared in families. To keep it to yourself is not what the gift is of the grace of that virtue.
Yeah, I love that line. It says, please take this grain of a grain of hope so that mine won't shrink.
Right.
We often, it's so uh, you know, we usually think if I break off something, get mine shrinking. But no, not with hope, not with love.
I was thinking of our community in Amityville. We each year or each set has a flower for the most part, and my flower was iris. And when I had my jubilee, one of the sisters in my house gave me 3 bulbs of irises to plant. 3 bulbs. So the first year we had the 3 irises, but then after that, I don't know if the squirrels ate some of it or what, but I've been watching for a couple of years. We had a big bush that grew next to it, and we figured, well, maybe the roots are not getting water. But for me, it's sort of like waiting. We cut down, not completely, but the bush that was next to it, we took some branches off so that more sun could get on it. So each year we're kind of waiting to see when they're going to flower, So I guess for me, hope is like waiting too, watching and caring.
I love the phrase unlikely source when she's talking about distributing the clustered roots, and she says unlikely source. It's kind of, Patty, what you were talking about earlier, about sometimes we're looking for one thing and we get something else, and we don't recognize the unlikely source for the hope that it can bring, for the gift that it is. So I like that. I like that image of the irises and distributing them, and then that phrase, unlikely source. I love that.
I like it too, because I like the fact that it says clumsy and earth covered, but you have to do something with it. You have to get in and divide it up. So hope doesn't, one of the things that really works against hope is inactivity. Recently, well, now it's been, I hate to say it, probably almost 3 months ago, but when the war broke out in Gaza, all of us pray, all of us send money, whatever we do. But I thought, and write letters, call our Congress people. So I thought, I have to get my body out. I mean, I have to do something physical, not just do emails or write letters or make telephone calls. So I gathered a group of our sisters and we went to San Francisco and joined a couple of thousand people for a day at down on Market Street, down by the Embarcadero, for peace in Gaza. And so, action, the point of telling the story is action breaks the dullness of feeling overpowered by despair or hopelessness, whatever word you want to use. It's the same thing as the little girl putting her one foot in front of the other. Hope is little, but you keep moving. You can't let walls block us. And so I love that part. I mean, every part of these, you have to be active in it. Where's this? Well, I mean, even with Mary Oliver's poem, joy is not to be a crumb. Hope is not to be a crumb. Work at it. so actually, when I was thinking of this grain of hope, I first thought like a grain of sand. And then I thought a grain. And so this is what I think you do if you want to write about something. So then you pondered a little bit. Then I thought a grain. What's a grain? Well, it could be a grain of wheat grain. It could be a grain of rice. It could be barley. It could be any kind of grain like that. And so, you know, if you were to have wheat put together and put yeast in it, it would grow.
Mhm.
So the image of bread, even though she doesn't say bread, but that's what poetry does. It doesn't only have to be this unlikely roots down below, but it could be this grain that grows. So when you think about your own life or you think about your writings, uh, it opens these up. The thing that I thought was interesting is I actually at first thought it was a crystal because I thought, you know, transparency, there's something about hope that is transparent. Courageous, you tell the truth, that gives you hope. So in this poem, as well as the other with Mary Oliver, I think there's a lot you could ponder here about your own experiences of hope. And maybe do a little writing. You know, writing is one way of responding. You know, they say with the Psalms, and we said it during the retreat, that the one who prays the psalm becomes the psalm.
Mm.
And so the one who writes about hope becomes more hopeful. The book that I mentioned by the book I mentioned, Zero at the Bone, by Christian Wyman. I mean, he's fighting against despair. That's really the point of a lot of his writings. And so what does he write about? He writes about hope and how he finds hope in all these different places. And I think hope has doesn't stand by itself. It's a great image of that Denise does for us as a grain of hope. But it doesn't stand, you have to have courage, you have to have insight, you have to have wisdom. And all of those come from actions. You know, maybe you make a mistake when you do something and it's the wrong thing. You learn from that and you go on. I don't know, do any of you want to say anything where you nationally, internationally, church-wise find hope?
Well, I find every time I hear Pope Francis speaks, I have hope. Because I think he's opening so many new areas, you know, that I remember, I think he said at some point, you know, we shouldn't give old answers to new questions. You know, we're evolving in our understanding of life and people and ourselves. And I think he just opens up to me the love of Christ, truly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I agree. I get a quote. One of the associates sends me a quote, Mary Bushman, of what the Holy Father said that day. I don't know where she gets it, but he always says something heartfelt and, like you say, visioning and hopeful, and that you know, I'm impressed by that, moved by that. Filled with hope, I guess, to have a pope think like that, you know.
I think locally of it's really more nationally, the young people who are fighting against guns in the schools. it's so great to see young people trying to organize. I mean, that I think is very hopeful.
Well, I said earlier that hope has some companions. So I'd like to tell you a couple of stories about companions to hope. As you know, so I'm just remind you, but St. Augustine says that hope has two companions, and he also speaks in feminine terms. This is St. Augustine. Anyway, he says hope has two lovely daughters, anger and courage. Anger at what is and should not be, and the courage to change what is possible. So I think that's great. So hope has two companions, anger and courage. Anger at what is and should not be, and the courage to change what is possible. And then our very, very dear friend, Joan Chittister, who I know we all have read and loved, our Benedictine sister, who's an author and contemplative peace activist. Anyway, he always ponders things in stories and parables and in proverbs. So she uses an Arab proverb that I had never heard before, but I love it. She says, this is her image of hope. She says, every morning I turn my face to the wind and scatter my seed. It is not difficult to scatter seeds, but it takes courage to go on facing the wind. So every morning I get up and I scatter my seed. It's not difficult to scatter the seeds, but it takes courage to go on and face the wind. And she explains it and says, the ability to stand steadfast in the face of opposition is the real charism of a sower. The commitment to say a different truth in the face of opposition is the virtue of the sower. The willingness to sow seed on barren ground, on rock, and in thorn bushes is the prophetic task of the sower. So the charism of the sower is to face opposition. It is to be steadfast. The virtue of the sower is to face opposition, and the willingness to sow on barren seed takes the courage, is the prophetic task of the sower. Maybe that's where Jesus gets some of his parables too. You know, he's always talking about seeds and farming. And in Matthew 13, verse 8, he has the sower of the parable of the sower who goes out and sows the seed. If you want to read the book that Joan Chittister wrote with this parable in it and others, it's called Scarred by Struggle, Transformed by Hope. It's an old book. I mean, I think she wrote it probably 20 years ago or something. Scarred by Struggle, Transformed by Hope.
Good title.
Yeah. So one of the things too about hope is how to become more hopeful. And I think we talked about this. We said taking an action. So it could be a political action, it could be a personal action, it could be a community action. You think of the Amityvilles and the hopeful things, decisions that you've made in the past, and it certainly affects your present lives. But even personally, I think one of the ways I was trying to think personally, how to get out of a dark place. And I thought sometimes maybe you feel hopeless about a situation, maybe a relationship. So you could talk to a friend about it. You could go to a counselor. And it would be a way of lifting the burden of the hopelessness or something that seems so blocked. It's a wall that can't be moved. Or if it's just something, I have a friend when she feels kind of down, she goes out to Point Reyes, which is close to the seashore. Now you have the seashore pretty close to you. A lot of people go out to the seashore or go walking. They go someplace that gives them joy. Or another way, personally, sometimes it's just to accept an invitation to do something with people who have similar interests. A friend of mine recently just joined an Audubon club because she really likes birds and she likes people. And so she decided it would get her out of her regular routine just to get out and do something different. And she started just becoming very chatty about the whole thing. She's really enjoying it. But those kinds of things can break kind of a sense of malaise in our lives. So if you were to think about somebody in your life who is a prophetic sower of hope, who would you think of? Pope, certainly the Pope, as you said, Joan.
Mm.
Who else gives you hope? I get a lot of hope in poetry.
I think of Greta.
Mm-hmm.
I think of my 8-year-old great niece who, just in her presence, I have such hope. She's a thinker, she's joyful, she's creative, she says what's on her mind, and it's delightful to be in her presence.
When I think of the future of the church, what gives me hope is some young families that I know and how they are passing the faith on to their children. And in particular, I'm thinking of one baptism and seeing the parents there answering the questions without having to repeat the words after the priest, and knowing that everything they said they really meant. And now to see their 2 children and growing up in this beautiful family. And that gives me hope. You know, I always say Rome can say what they want. And then you see these people who are living their faith in their homes. And then I know we have a future.
Mm.
We also get hope when I get the letters from our sisters in Ukraine. I just got one recently, and I'm on a board, and so I have requested money for them, and we sent them money. And but the sisters in Ukraine are part of the Dominican sisters in Madrid. And so they just wrote a Christmas letter to me. And they never end their letter was incredible. You know, I mean, they talk in such hopeful ways about, you know, they had Christmas on 2 different days, but not Christmas of the day because they were so afraid it would be destroyed at that time. So, I mean, I can't go through the whole letter, but a year ago, let's see, I think within the year, we got a letter from them. Actually, I've written down here last January, we got a letter from them, and they described in Kyiv that they had a museum, and in the museum was this large painting. Some of you might remember this story, a large painting of the crucifixion. And because of the bombing, it had been ripped by shrapnel, but they kept it up. They didn't hide it because it wasn't perfect. They kept it up as a symbol of resurrection for them. And it underlined for them not just the suffering they were going through, but their belief in the resurrection. And I thought, to have those kinds of eyes to see that and be filled with that kind of hope. So I think there's so much more could be said about hope, and I'm sure if I gave you time to talk, you might even have a chance to say something. But anyway, I hope that you'll take the papers that I gave you and kind of go through them and do some writing yourself. We're all on this conversation this evening because we know we have to pray that our hope will be sustained and that what we hope for will become a vision. So I know we're almost finished, but I also will hope that you will pray for our congregation because today's Monday, and starting on, we have a funeral first, we have a vigil, then we have a funeral. Then starting Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, we open our chapter. So we will begin our chapter on Friday, and it will be elections, but we do it, the beginning of chapter is this weekend, then it will continue during our March weekend, and we have another weekend put in there. And finally, it won't end until June. So we do it in sections because there's always so much to talk about. And so ask for your prayers for us that as your sisters, as your cousins too, that we're all in this together. So I know you will pray for us and keep us in your daily prayers. One other thing I wanted to say too, some of you who made the retreat with us got those little packages of seeds. I don't know if you planted them, but Jude did, and another sister I brought some seeds home to did. And let's see, how can I show you? You can't see, but they're, oh look, you get their plants have gotten quite large. Now, Jude says his hasn't flowered yet. He said, I think I put too many in too small of a little place. But my friend she put some outside. I was thinking about the squirrels. She put some outside, which the squirrels dug up and messed up. But she still has hers, and hers has started to flower because she separated them. There were too many.
Oh, nice.
So I don't know if any of you did that with yours, or check it out at another house, see if any of them
Okay.
did, see what
we
happened
did.
to them. Yeah.
We planted some.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And the very last part of the paper I gave you has like a closing, but it also said, and we use this at the retreat, to make us steadfast daughters of hope. And so that is our prayer for one another. And thank you for your prayers too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you very
Patty,
much.
Very
Thanks.
for all of the work and the preparation, Patty, on behalf of everyone, all of the work and preparation you put into this, and the seeds you planted in us about. So they'll grow in their own ways, and maybe you'll never see them, but we will, and the world will. So we're grateful to you for everything you did for us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank
Thank
you
you.
for taking an hour and a half out of your own day for this conversation. And it's been a pleasure for me too.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Pat,
Thank you.
Hope
Pat.
pray
Anyway,
for you.
Come,
Yes.
thank, yes, that would be really nice. We have a lot of big listeners.
and thank you, Margaret and Ann,
Thank you, Rick.
also
And
for all
thank
you've
you.
done.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks,
Thank
Margaret,
you.
for the
Thank you.
invitation.
Patty, I'll
Yes.
Thank
talk
you.
to you, okay?
Good night.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Night.
No,
Right,
Bye now.
everybody.
Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.
Happy New
Bye,
Year.
everybody.
Happy New
Yes,
Year.
Happy
Thank
New
you.
Year to all.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
See, I have to recording. Stop the recording. I can't see.
How many people were on? Was it 8, maybe?
Yeah, there was supposed to be 12, but the number of people.
Who was on? Joan, Bernard.